The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, hello everyone.
We have a little bit of housekeeping to do tonight before we get into the stories. We just want to take a second and remind everyone that we do have some pretty cool merch in our TeePublic store. There's some really cool designs that feature our podcast name that you can get on all kinds of things, from mugs to t-shirts to throw pillows, and they're really well made. Some of our listeners, in fact, have sent us pics of their purchases and are extremely happy with the quality.
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of pictures of stuff, which is pretty cool. And if you've been thinking about buying something for yourself or for someone you love who loves our show, now is a great time to check it out. You can find the link on our website, whereourmindswander.com.
And while you're at it, we should also mention that if you've been thinking about leaving us a 5-star review and a comment, well, now's a great time to do that. Just go to your favorite listening app, or you can leave one on our website.
Yeah, and even though it only takes a few seconds to do, and it might have been on your to-do list for a while, we totally get that real life sometimes gets in the way. So we greatly appreciate all of you who have left a review because they mean a lot to us. And for all of our YouTube listeners, hit that subscribe button for us. That helps us out in a huge way, too.
And lastly, we want to give a big shout out to one of our listeners in Kenosha, Wisconsin. They wrote us a fan letter on Buzzsprout. We appreciate you taking the time to do that, and we appreciate the 5-star review. We're so glad you're part of the Wanderer family.
Yeah, it was pretty cool to hear from a listener through fan mail, which is pretty new to our host, Buzzsprout. It will only send us a text, though, so the only downside is we can't respond to those fan letters on Buzzsprout. But if you head over to our website, whereourmindswander.com, you can send us mail there that we can respond to. Or you could hit the microphone icon and you could send us a voicemail. It's that easy.
All right, Beth, I think that about wraps it up for the housekeeping this week, right?
Yes.
So what do you have to share with us this week?
Well, actually, I have another update, which is always exciting to me. So this one is about the lost colony of Roanoke, which we covered in a previous episode. And it's kind of exciting. So recently, archaeologists excavating an Algonquin settlement on Roanoke discovered pottery and a copper ring side by side in the same layer of sediment. And that might not seem like a big deal, but the ring dates back to the time of the lost colony. And so they believe that it proves that the Algonquin people had to have traded with the lost colony settlers. So although the discovery doesn't really put them any closer to finding exactly where the lost colony was on Roanoke, it does prove that they had some sort of trading relationship with the Algonquin people who were already there. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I thought so.
Well, it is. And it's nice to have little updates to stories.
Yeah.
Because no matter what we talk about, somebody's always researching and finding out a little bit something more.
Yes.
So why don't you tell everyone where your mind wandered for this episode tonight?
Okay, so Since last week's episode was a little dark, you and I had talked about trying to focus on some lighter, more fun stuff for tonight. So my topic came from that magazine that you got at the thrift store and brought home.
Oh, yeah. That was a really cool find.
It really was. So within the last week or so, Wes came home with this magazine that he'd picked up. And it's from December of 1968. And it's similar in size to the old Reader's Digest, but it's called Beyond. And I read through most of it, and I got a huge kick out of it. But one of the articles initially caught my eye because it had a super long title. Are you ready? This is like one of the longest titles ever.
I know. I bought the book. I bought it because the artwork on it was just fantastic.
The cover artwork.
Yes.
Yes. So this one article was titled, Ghost in Black Haunts British Home in Quest for Casket of Jewels. Family Witness Frequent Visits of Strange Apparition, by John Macklin. So turns out it was a great little article. It was only a couple pages, but I was intrigued because it starred a 19-year-old girl in the 1880s who did her own paranormal investigating in her own house to try to figure out who was haunting it. So, for my half tonight, I'm going to tell you all about the Lady in Black. Once a spa town on the edge of the Cotswolds, Cheltenham, England was a bustling place for hundreds of years before the house known as Garden Reach was built on Pittville Circus Road in 1863. Rosina Despard and her family purchased Garden Reach, which the family later named Donore, in April of 1882. Rosina and her 5 sisters, along with her invalid mother and captain father, had already heard stories that their new home was haunted. But with the house being so new, not even 20 years old, and being of skeptical minds, the family settled in. One evening in June of 1882, Rosina had gone up to her room as usual. According to the Sci Encyclopedia website, Rosina wasn't even in bed yet when she heard a sound at her bedroom door. Thinking it was her mother, Rosina opened the door, expecting to see her standing there. Rosina stepped out into the hallway, thinking maybe her mother was just a few steps away. But instead, Rosina claimed, quote, "On going a few steps along the passage, I saw the figure of a tall lady dressed in black, standing at the head of the stairs. After a few moments, she descended the stairs, and I followed for a short distance, feeling curious what it could be. I had only a small piece of candle, and it suddenly burnt itself out. And being unable to see more, I went back to my room." End quote. It's like she's read out of a novel. She's so cool.
She does seem pretty cool.
Yeah. The figure she had seen was definitely a woman, although she was rather tall and dressed entirely in black. Rosina speculated that the fabric was a soft wool, since the dress didn't make much sound as the figure moved. She couldn't see the woman's face. She held a handkerchief in her right hand up near her cheek, so her face was obscured. Her left hand was lost in the folds of her skirt. Rosina didn't see any sort of cap on the woman, but she had the impression that the woman wore either a veil or a hood. The style of her dress strongly suggested that they were widow's weeds, the mourning dress that a new widow would wear. Rosina encountered the Lady in Black a dozen more times over the next 4 years. Although her manifestations were completely random, Rosina noted that they were often preceded by the sound of footsteps. Convinced that the mourning woman was in some sort of distress, brave Rosina actually tried to speak to her on January 29th of 1884. She said in her accounts of that night that the lady in black actually seemed to acknowledge Rosina's existence and that she gasped in surprise.
That's pretty cool. It's almost as though the dimensions are overlapping.
Yeah.
And not only that, she's only 19 years old. And she's got the cojones to,
Go after her.
Yeah, speak to her. Try to communicate.
There's more. This girl had gumption, that's for sure. Because after that, Rosina was determined to communicate with the apparition. During another encounter, Rosina claimed that the lady in black appeared to try and utter words, but she was unable to produce any sound. Hoping maybe to touch her, Rosina even managed to corner the lady in black one evening, but before she could get close enough, the figure vanished. So, she thought, at the very least, maybe she could photograph her. But taking a photograph in the 1880s, back when they needed such long exposures and trying to take pictures in the dark, proved to be fruitless. But I mean, come on, she's 19. She's tried to touch her, she's tried to talk to her, and she tried to photograph her. She was a cool kid. Up until this point, Rosina was the only one in her family to even see the lady in black. Initially, her parents assured her that it was all in her imagination, but by July of 1884, they all began to see her too. Rosina's sister, Freda, watched the lady in black walk across a hallway, while outside one day, Captain Despard saw her through a window, standing in the empty drawing room. And then Edith, another of Rosina's sisters, had the unnerving experience of passing by the apparition on the stairs one night. One of the housemaids was startled by a figure that she initially assumed was an intruder in the house. But when she tried to follow it, she found herself in an empty room with no other exit. And then there was the neighbor who was passing by the house one day and saw a woman in black standing in the Despards' orchard. The concerned neighbor asked the family who their grieving visitor was. Now, Rosina Despard was incredibly practical in her investigation of the lady in black. And keep in mind, it was 1884 and she was only 19 years old. Through her own documentation, she determined that the spirit walked the same pattern every single time she appeared inside the house. According to the Maryland Paranormal Research website, the lady in black would materialize on the second floor, walk down the hallway to the stairs, and descend to the first floor. From there, she would enter the drawing room, stay for a brief moment or two, and then exit through a narrow doorway into the garden. Not long into the garden, she would vanish. Documenting her routine, attempting to touch her, and trying to photograph her wasn't all that Rosina tried either. The incredibly clever girl tied thin threads across thresholds that the spirit often crossed. Since the lady in black always appeared solid and like a living person, Rosina wondered if the apparition would break the threads, or perhaps her skirt would become caught in them. She noted that not a single thread was snagged or even moved as the spirit walked through. Now, someone from the Despard family contacted Frederick Myers of the Society of Psychical Research. Now, I'd like to think that it was Rosina herself, but more than likely it was probably her father, Captain Despard. Regardless, Myers arrived at the house in 1886. Now, Frederick Myers was one of the founding members of the society. He was a poet and a classicist and a scholar of the written language. He actually came up with his own theories about the subliminal self and why hauntings occur. He was so intrigued by the Garden Reach haunting, and I'd assume by Rosina's almost scientific research of it, that he arrived at the Despards' home hoping to catch sight of the apparition himself, and luckily, he did. Myers also interviewed 17 different people who said they had encountered the lady in black, both at night and during the day, inside the home and in the garden. In his research of the house, he landed on a likely suspect. The home was built between 1863 and 1864, with the first occupants being a man named Henry Swinhoe and his wife, Elizabeth. Whether Henry was already a heavy drinker isn't known, but when Elizabeth died, there's speculation that Henry turned to drinking out of a broken heart. But he soon married a woman named Imogen, and he and his new wife argued constantly. As a result, they both drank heavily. There was one time when Henry was so intoxicated that he purposely tried to overturn a baby carriage while the baby, Gustav Holst, was in it. Henry found himself in court over that debacle. Gustav Holst, by the way, grew up to be a famous music composer and teacher. But anyway, the relationship between Henry and Imogen wasn't great. In the Beyond magazine that I mentioned from 1968, author Macklin added to the story by saying that one of the major fights between Henry and Imogen was over his first wife's jewelry. Imogen, as the current wife, felt she was entitled to wear Elizabeth's jewelry, but Henry refused to let her. Eventually, Henry was so enraged by Imogen's insistence that he hired a carpenter to pull up the floorboards in the drawing room and create a little hiding spot for his dead wife's box of jewelry. Imogen did end up leaving him and moving to Bristol. Henry passed away in 1876, and Imogen died just 2 years later. Now, Myers had an inkling that the lady in black could be either Elizabeth or Imogen Swinhoe. Tracking down photographs of both women, he showed them to Rosina, and she felt pretty confident that the ghost in her house was Imogen. According to the Sci Encyclopedia website, Myers wished to protect the Despards' identity, so he referred to them as the Mortons in his case files. He referred to the Morton case as one of the, quote, most remarkable and best authenticated instances of haunting on record, end quote. This was mostly due to Rosina Despard's meticulously written accounts and her attempt at science-based experiments to capture evidence. He described Rosina herself as, quote, a lady of scientific training, end quote, and her family as unusually free from superstitious fear. And, according to the Beyond article, after Myers' visit, the Despards allegedly thought about Imogen's routine walk through the house and decided the drawing room was the most likely spot to see if there was actually a hidden compartment under the floorboards. Now, allegedly, they did find a hidden compartment. However, it was empty.
Well, even if it wasn't, I wouldn't say anything about it. I'd keep it all to myself.
Well, true.
I'm like, nope, didn't find anything.
Right. Now, just to be clear, I couldn't find any part of the jewelry aspect of the story in any of the other documentation about the case, so it may or may not be true. I don't know about that part. However, Rosina Despard became the 23rd woman to graduate with a medical degree in England, and she later became the physician at Holloway Women's Prison. So she was a pretty remarkable young lady. After the Despards moved on from Garden Reach in 1893, the property became a boys' school, and then it was a nunnery. By the 1920s, it was being used by the Diocese of Gloucester and was renamed St. Anne's. In the 1950s and 60s, the Lady in Black was seen in the hallways. But in 1973, the house was converted into apartments, which it still is today. A local woman was learning to drive one day in 1970, and as she and her driving instructor drove past the house, a figure stepped into the road in front of the car. The woman slammed on her brakes to avoid hitting her, and the confused driving instructor demanded to know why she'd slammed on her brakes. The poor woman tried to explain that she'd just seen a woman in a long black dress walk in front of the car, but the instructor hadn't seen anything at all. In 2021, Christian Jensen Romer published a paper for the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomena, in which he uncovered a completely different explanation for the Lady in Black. He found that during the days when the Swinhoes still lived in the house, one of their maids dressed up as a ghost during a bonfire night party. One of the errand boys who worked for the family was so scared by this maid in this costume, he thought she was an actual ghost. He was so scared he actually attacked her. And how he attacked her wasn't mentioned in the source that I looked at, but apparently it was bad enough that it went to court. Romer suggests that this story may have been embellished over time, and that the Despards may have heard some of these embellished stories. The implication, of course, is that, as a family, they could have manifested the apparition themselves based on their collective knowledge of this embellished story.
So they think that perhaps they created a tulpa.
Maybe, yeah.
I don't
or
buy it.
Poltergeist, you know.
Right.
Frederick Myers didn't buy that theory either because he left the house believing that it was haunted. When he asked all 17 of those witnesses when they were sure the apparition wasn't actually a living, breathing person, they all gave variations of the same answer. They said they knew when, quote, she just disappeared into thin air before my eyes, end quote.
That's amazing.
I know. And to think it was back in the 1880s when this 19-year-old girl was like, you know what, I'm gonna get to the bottom of this, and I'm gonna scientifically prove that my house is haunted.
Yeah, she didn't scare easy.
No, I mean, can you imagine she sees this thing in the hallway and her next thought is, I'm gonna try to corner it and touch it.
I know. And then she goes on to be a medical doctor.
Yeah, at a prison.
Right.
She's pretty amazing.
We'll be right back after this quick break.
Hey, did you know? In 1895, Nellie Simmons Meyer began a 40-year career in palm reading based on what she claimed were ancient Egyptian methods. She was so accurate and so well known, she earned the nickname Palm Reader to the stars. Some of her most famous clients included Mary Pickford, Walt Disney, Susan B. Anthony, Amelia Earhart, Joan Crawford, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was so impressed by Nellie's abilities that she even got FDR to give it a try. Eleanor, by the way, was one of the very first ladies to ever say she encountered Lincoln's ghost in the White House. Who'da thunk it? All right, we're back. So, what are you going to talk about tonight?
So tonight, I get the fun half of the episode, which I hope you all find as interesting as I do, because some of it's pretty eye-opening. So I want everyone to take a moment and think about their favorite Wild West movie. There's like 3,000 to choose from. My personal favorite is Tombstone. My favorite character? Well, that was Doc Holliday. And who could forget that iconic line, "I'm your Huckleberry"?
Exactly. Val Kilmer made that movie.
That he did. They could have never casted anybody else in that role except for Val Kilmer.
Yeah.
He made that movie.
He did. He was brilliant in that movie. You know, I don't know if I have a favorite Western movie, but a couple of my all-time favorite movies happen to be Westerns. I mean, The Hateful Eight was pretty good. We really liked that.
Oh, The Hateful Eight was great.
Yes. And A Million Ways to Die in the West, which we must have watched at least 24 times. And we spent a lot of time quoting it to each other for weeks afterwards.
Yeah, you and my daughter, you watched quite a bit of that.
Well, you did too. You just pretended not to.
She really liked it, though.
Yeah. It was a great movie.
But I grew up watching Clint Eastwood movies, and I think that my favorite two are Josie Wales and Pale Rider.
Well, you made me watch those. I like those too. I had never seen them before.
No, you had never watched the old Westerns.
No.
They were the best.
You know what else we did watch? I don't know if TV shows count, but we really got into Deadwood for a while.
Yeah, but you know what? As good as that show was, it didn't quite capture the daily life of people living in the Wild West the way I'm going to describe it tonight. I'm going to tell everyone about what it was really like.
Ruh-roh.
Yeah.
I know. I was like, is there more to that sentence? I'm not sure. I'm going to find this fun. You're saying it's fun. I'll trust you.
Now, the Wild West period in American history only lasted 30 years, from 1865 to 1895. Think about that. It only lasted 30 years, and it wasn't really that long ago.
No, it was a very short period of time, and they managed to pack a whole heck of a lot of history into those 30 years.
The California Gold Rush was kind of the beginning because boom towns sprang up all over the West. But it was really the railroad that turned quiet stretches of western desert into the rough and dirty Wild West towns that gave people like Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Annie Oakley, Wild Bill Hickok, and Buffalo Bill Cody a place to stake their claims on history. But the 1,400 fictional novels and 3,000 movies, as I had mentioned earlier, do tend to romanticize the Wild West in some way. Not that it's their fault. It would be pretty hard to give moviegoers a fully immersive experience of what the Wild West was really like. And frankly, I don't think that many people would want to fully immerse themselves because the Wild West was pretty much stinky. I mean, literally, it stunk. To begin with, everyone at the time believed that having clean skin made it easier for bacteria and germs to stick to you. In other words, clean, freshly bathed skin was actually dangerous to your health. Because people believed this so wholeheartedly, bathing was something people rarely did. And quite honestly, bathtubs were downright expensive. According to HistoryTalk.com, most people couldn't afford bathtubs until Sears and Roebuck's put them in their catalogs in 1894, and they were around $32. That's around $800 to $900 in today's money, so that's pretty expensive. There were public bathhouses, of course, that existed in the larger towns as early as the 1850s, but even that was expensive at $2 a soak. That's about $62 in today's money.
I wouldn't pay $62 to take a bath.
No way. And your soak in the bathtub was more than likely in the same exact water as several people before you. It was too much of a hassle to reheat the water on the stove and refill the tub with new water in between bathers. So basically, you were bathing in already dirty water. But according to grunge.com, that didn't bother one bather in 1863. The poor man fell asleep in a public bathhouse and was charged $5.50 for his nap.
Well, that's expensive. That's like 130-something. Math's not my specialty, but it's like 130-something bucks.
It's quite expensive.
For his nap.
Yeah. Larger cities often had private bathtubs in their brothels, but that wasn't even until the turn of the century, which is a little beyond Wild West days. But a bubble bath in a brothel would cost you anywhere from $50 to $80. If you want a little perspective on that, that would be around $1,716 in today's money.
Holy bubble bath.
But I want you all to think about that. Men spent most of their daily lives on a horse. And they didn't want their horses to get sick, since they depended on them for pretty much everything. So men spent most of their daily lives riding on dirty, rarely bathed horses. When a man dismounted and walked anywhere, the stench of his body and the stench of his horse followed him everywhere. And it wasn't just dirt and body odor either, because they did sweaty work and they didn't bathe regularly. Most men in the Wild West had fungus issues, most commonly in their armpits, butt cracks, and groin area. As you can imagine, it itched like hell. The soap they used, if they used any at all, most likely only added to the problem. In the Wild West, soap was made from lard, animal fat. First, it didn't smell the greatest. And second, it often caused more skin irritations than anything else. Some people used soapweed, which was somewhat better. When the roots of a yucca plant are crushed, they create a kind of sudsy liquid similar to soap suds. Mexican women historically used it to wash their hair, and so some Wild West settlers used it too. Soapweed was much, much better than the other options available, but not everyone knew about it. Men of the Wild West tended to have long hair. Maybe that's because there weren't any barbers in a lot of the towns, or maybe it was just a fashion statement. But regardless, if they weren't going to wash their bodies, they certainly weren't going to wash their hair either. Women were a little better. When they did find clean water, which wasn't easy, and I'll get to that in a minute, they would wash their hands and faces daily. They'd also mask whatever odor they could with perfume.
Let's put perfume on top of stink. That'll help.
Well, I think some people still do it today.
Well, yeah, that's true. You're not wrong there.
Deodorant for women wasn't invented until 1888. Called Mums, it was 100% zinc oxide mixed with a lotion-like cream. Some deodorants today still have zinc oxide in them, and the FDA says it's totally safe to use. Some people even prefer it because it doesn't clog pores. But they couldn't use it on everything. So how did they combat issues in other places of the bodies? Especially since they were encased in wool stockings, pantaloons, petticoats, and skirts? Well, they did it with Lysol. Yes, the same Lysol we have today. Only women in the Wild West were using it down there.
No, they weren't.
Oh, they were.
No.
Makes you squeaky clean.
No. Oh, my gosh. Exactly the same Lysol that we have in our houses today.
That's right.
Oh, my gosh.
Initially invented as a cure for cholera, it was quickly marketed as a cure for all women's issues. Ladies in the Wild West used Lysol on a daily basis. Lysol, by the way, was made with creosoles, which is basically the part of the stuff in carbolic acid, which is made from coal and wood. Just like Lysol now, it can cause severe burning, inflammation, and even death.
And they were using it in their delicate areas.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. That just blows me away.
Aren't you glad you didn't live in the Wild West?
Though, it does make me think of A Million Ways to Die in the West. The scene where Edward and Ruth are about to consummate their relationship for the first time. And he says to her, "Are you in pain right now?" And she goes, "Why? Like, what's wrong?" And he says, "It looks like a firecracker wrapped in roast beef."
That was one of the best lines of the
Maybe
movie.
that's what he was alluding to the fact that,
I know.
Well,
It's like maybe they did some research.
I'm sure they did. Seth MacFarlane is a pretty smart guy. But oh my gosh, that makes more sense than I want it to.
Well,
Thank you.
I love that. Plus, I really liked the part about his sheep named Bridget that was always up on the roof.
Yes. Poor Bridget. She was full of love.
That she was. Another common belief at the time was that women were supposed to have perfectly unblemished skin. And for white women, their skin could be as pale as possible. This was rather impossible for most women, since they also spent a great deal of time outdoors. So in order to achieve this pale skin, they'd slather all kinds of creams on themselves. The creams were mostly made of mercury, and some were made with arsenic. Often, others were just simply bleach.
Lovely.
I know. But you wouldn't have any problem there because you're as pale as Casper.
I know. I told you that was my nickname when I worked on Cape Cod, as they all called me Casper, because they'd all go out and get their suntans, and I'd be pale.
Right. I think Casper actually has more color than you do.
Oh, thanks.
According to newswithfirstpick.com, unlike the men of the time, women did try to wash their hair. The most common shampoo was simply a cup of whiskey mixed with castor oil. Then to soften up their locks, they'd rinse it out with rainwater and some borax. So basically, they would grease it up with alcohol and oil and then calm it down with borax. Borax, by the way, can be poisonous if inhaled or applied to skin. When they wanted a little bounce in their hair, they'd wrap their still damp hair around heated up pencils. So, women did try, but they were basically poisoning themselves in the process. Men didn't try, but were essentially walking fungi. So it was a pretty dirty place.
Yeah.
So remember that I had mentioned that women had a hard time finding clean water to wash their hands and faces. This was true for everyone, not just women, and it had something to do with outhouses. Most houses had an outhouse. It was a basic wooden structure surrounding a hole dug in the ground. Roll-style toilet paper wasn't invented until 1890, so prior to that, people used all kinds of things. Using clumps of grass was pretty common, or a handful of leaves, unless a family was lucky enough to have a Sears and Roebuck's catalog. They were pretty thick, and they had a lot of pages that could be torn out and crumpled up. Newspapers could also be used in a pinch, but by far the most common toilet paper was actually a corn cob. Sometimes there were two corn cobs, a yellow corn cob and a red one. You used the red one first, and then the yellow one was a test to see if you got it all.
Oh.
So if it came out clean, hey, you knew you did a pretty good job with that cob.
No. That's gross.
Well, I can imagine that some of those corn cobs also got inserted in places that they should not have.
I don't even have a comment.
But back to my story. Oh, and by the way, the cobs were not cleaned after use. They were simply set aside and reused over and over until the cob was too far gone to do much good.
Oh, gosh. Blech.
All this communal cob using led to all kinds of diseases being spread around between family members, and in some cases, entire towns. There typically wasn't any water pumps nearby, so washing your hands after a trip to the outhouse meant dipping your hands in any nearby stream. That's why most outhouses tended to be built upstream along waterways. But eventually, all that human waste leached into nearby water sources, making the water downstream just as full of disease and bacteria as the outhouse itself. Imagine going to wash your face in a stream that was full of an entire street's worth of outhouse runoff.
I wonder if they threw the dirty cobs in there after they were done with them, too.
I wouldn't doubt it. There'd be no other purpose for them.
No.
After a long day of working outside, either panning for gold laying down railroad tracks, herding cattle, or whatever else you might be doing during your day, most men had two destinations that they would frequent when the sun went down: the saloon for a drink or their bed for some much-needed rest. Either option had its own gross factors, but let's visit the saloon first. To begin with, alcohol in the Wild West isn't like the alcohol that we know of today. Sure, there's still moonshine these days, and we drink quite a bit of it, but nothing like the firewater that most Wild West men drank. The lovely concoction known as firewater was also known by some other names like rot gut, tarantula juice, and coffin varnish. Made from pure alcohol, usually whiskey, the juice from chewing tobacco and burnt sugar, firewater could literally rot your guts, especially since enterprising saloon owners often watered down their drinks with turpentine, formaldehyde, and ammonia. Then they would add gunpowder or cayenne pepper for flavoring. So it's no wonder patrons often died from alcohol poisoning.
Well, they weren't being poisoned by the alcohol. They were being poisoned by the formaldehyde and turpentine that they were putting in it.
Right.
And when you say the juice from chewing tobacco, that's what you said, right?
Yes.
So I'm assuming it's the spittoon juice that everybody's spitting there.
That's quite possible.
That makes me want to gag. That's awful.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you've ever swallowed chewing tobacco or the juice from it, it's horrendous. It's not good.
Jeez.
If firewater wasn't your thing, another popular drink was cactus wine. According to grunge.com, cactus wine was a mixture of tequila and peyote tea, so I can imagine that it really packed a punch. Now, the chewing tobacco juice in drinks sounds gross enough on its own, but it also pretty much coated the floors. Saloon floors were often covered in sawdust, and if a spittoon wasn't handy, patrons simply spit on the floor. This constant floor spitting created the perfect breeding ground for all kinds of bacteria and germs, especially pneumonia and tuberculosis. And the spittoons themselves weren't much better, since they were rarely emptied in a timely manner. And who in the heck would want to do that job anyways? You can only imagine how gross it was.
I think in some ways that's more gross than a bedpan. Because bedpans at least would get emptied on a routine basis, but those spittoons would sit there probably for weeks before they would be emptied. And we have some, but at least they're reproductions.
Yeah, we have one real spittoon. It's very short, very low to the ground. They don't look anything like the reproduction ones that you see.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they have such a small opening at the top, I can see why it would go onto the floor.
Right, you'd have to have really good spit aim to get it in there.
Right.
That's just gross. That's my word for tonight. Gross.
And sitting at the bar itself, back then wasn't really a thing. There really wasn't any bar stools. Most patrons stood at the bar, resting one foot on a metal pipe that was anchored a few inches off the floor. If you were lucky enough to find a seat, it was most likely a whiskey barrel. But standing at the bar was better, because at least you could wipe off your beard and mustache after a frothy glass of firewater with a bar towel. These bar towels hung every few feet along the bar, and you guessed it, they were used by everyone, and they were hardly, if ever, washed. That's pretty disgusting.
That's gross, too.
If you were to go out for dinner at a restaurant in the Wild West, well, you might have thought twice about the utensils and even the plates your meal was served on. Because clean water was scarce, and heating up water to properly wash the used dishes was such a pain in the butt, most restaurants didn't even bother. They would simply wipe a dirty dish or glass or a fork with a cloth right at the table and then leave it there for the next dinner. So let's say you braved the saloon and a restaurant dinner and now it's time to head to bed. Or maybe you skipped the rowdy establishments altogether and just headed straight to a bed after a long day of work. The beds had to be comfy, right? They certainly always seem to be in the movies, with their iron headboards and huge feather pillows. Maybe the blankets weren't the cleanest, but the bed itself had to be pretty comfy, right?
I'm guessing not.
Well, of course not. First, if you were lucky enough to even have a bed and not just be sleeping on the floor, your mattress was hardly ever stuffed with feathers. Barely anyone could afford that luxury back then. For most people, their mattresses were stuffed with straw and hay. And what likes to crawl around in straw and hay? All kinds of things. But seam squirrels were the biggest problem. Nowhere near as cute as they may sound, seam squirrels were body lice, which are very different from head lice because they're bigger. These body lice like to lay eggs in the seams of clothing and in the seams of bedding. You may know them as cooties, or the ever-descriptive pants rabbits. I don't know which I like more, cooties or pants rabbits. Now, when I was growing up, if a girl touched a boy or whatever on the playground, they'd be going, oh, he's got cooties.
Yes, we used to do that too.
I wish I knew about pants rabbits back then because that's what I would have been yelling. Pants rabbits. So yeah, movies about the Wild West could never quite capture the odors of the time period. And hardly any of them, except a few, really try to capture the true itchiness and complete lack of hygiene that existed. We'd probably much rather focus on the idealism and the romanticism of the Wild West, even if it isn't true to life at all.
So I'm not going to say gross again, because that was my word for most of what you were talking about. I'm trying to think of other words for gross besides disgusting and disturbing and icky. It was interesting, though.
Well, I knew about the corn cobs for quite a long time now because, we do research all the time, and plus we're just history buffs. But the Lysol, that's the worst.
That is really bad. It makes me cringe just thinking about it.
How did anybody have sex back then to have all these large families? It must have hurt like hell.
Yeah, it could not have been very enjoyable.
No. And it got me to thinking, just now, did these women carry Lysol around in their purses?
Well, I'm sure it didn't come in spray cans.
No, but if you're out, and you're on this romantic picnic by the...
dirty water?
The dirty water, or you went for a swim in the dirty water when you got out before you had like a romantic interlude.
Yeah. Did
you wash it up with Lysol?
No, I'm sure you probably waited till later when you were alone in your room. I hate to ruin your scenario there, but I'm thinking no, it was done later in private.
I don't even want to think about oral sex back then.
God. Ew. First, I can't believe you said that. And second of all, ew.
Yeah. We're so lucky to live in this day and age.
We really are. Very lucky.
Well, I really enjoyed my story.
I enjoyed your story too. It was a lot lighter this week than last week. So.
Yeah, I know you found it kind of dark.
I know. Well, as always, if you would like to know more, you can check our sources in our show notes to see where we kind of got our starting point for putting our episode together. There's a lot more there, so check it out if you are interested.
With that said, we'll see you all next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.